All right. Well, God bless you. And thank you to Charlie for inviting me to share the word. Recently, Sheila and I were down in El Salvador. We had the privilege of going down and representing really all of you when we went down to spend time with the believers. And we usually try and do the timing right around when they have their camp. This year, it was just basically about a 24-hour time period at a beautiful location in the mountains outside of San Salvador. And Ricardo, who is their leader down there, Zalata, he had chosen the theme, Don't Stop Believing. I thought of that song that Journey sang that became so popular with that line. But when I went out and looked at the lyrics are horrible. So we'll just stick with the word and not the Journey song. So I decided I'd just use that same theme to teach, and I'm going to share what I shared down there with the believers in El Salvador. I titled it, Don't Stop Believing, See the Power of God in Action. It's great to be with you here on this December 3rd, 2023. It's hard to believe we're in the last few days of this year. We refer to ourselves as believers. We've heard the phrase believing equals receiving, but have you ever asked yourself, believing, what is it really? If we say we should be doing it and we refer to ourselves that way, then we should really understand what it means and how to apply it and live it. Believe is simply defined as accepting something as true, at times without proof. In religious terms, it's often referred to as faith. That could be described as, in my opinion, or in my thinking, more of a passive approach. And again, I'm not trying to redefine these terms. I just want you to think about some things, and so I'm trying to make a distinction here. So I would describe faith as being more of a passive approach. Most times when we say to believe, we mean it in a much more active way. Although the words believe and faith are often used interchangeably, I think there's a real distinction between the two in application, and that's what I'm trying to get to. So let's just consider that for a moment. We have faith that the Bible is a revealed word and will of God. We can't do anything to affect that truth, whether we believe it or don't believe it, right? No matter what actions we take. We either choose to accept it or we don't. We have faith that Jesus Christ is the only begotten Son of God. We can either deny it, or by faith, we can trust that it's true. But we believe that God will supply all our needs. To see that manifested, we must take action to receive it. We don't just accept it and voila, everything we need just appears. It doesn't work that way. I would like to focus on the aspect of believing that's more active. So again, this whole thing, like I said, if God supplies our needs, if we believe that as a truth, it doesn't automatically happen. And that's why I'm making these distinctions between what I'm calling a passive believing and an active believing. One more aspect we should handle. Believing works for the saint and sinner alike. So goes the saying, and that's true. Believing is a godly principle, but not restricted only to godly people. Anyone who operates believing will receive results. Just like gravity works for everyone, regardless of who they are. And believing can bring either positive or negative results. The most positive results will come when we believe and act on what God tells us to believe and do. So we're going to take a look at a couple of examples in the Word of what I'm calling active believing. We're going to go to 2 Kings chapter 4. There's a number of these in the Word, but just due to time, we're going to just look at 2 or 3 of them. 2 Kings chapter 4, and in verse 1, it says, Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant, my husband, is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear or respect the Lord, and the creditors come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. Now think about this situation. Here's this woman whose husband was a believer, had been acting. He had done the work. He was working with the prophet Elisha, and this man dies, and he owed money. So back in those days, you just didn't file bankruptcy and everything's wiped off the slates, you had to pay it back. And if you couldn't pay it back or you didn't have a means to reimburse them, they would take your family, your children, maybe even you, and you'd have to work it off until the debt was paid. Well, here she is in this terrible situation where she's lost her husband, and now it looks like there's a good possibility she's going to lose her two sons. She would be left destitute and alone. She couldn't go out and find a job to take care of herself. Those weren't those kind of days and times. So she's in a very, very bad situation. So she goes to the only place she can get the word at that time, which is through the prophets. And so she goes to Elisha and she's saying, what am I supposed to do? And verse 2, and Elisha said unto her, what shall I do for thee? Tell me. He's like, well, you expecting me to pay this bill? What do you want me to do? Tell me what thou hast in the house. Logical question. Is there anything you can sell? Anything worth anything that we can help defer this cost? And she said, thine handmaid hath not anything in the house save a pot of oil. Now, this oil would not have been like Crisco or something like that. This oil had some value to it. It was worth something. And so she says, I have a pot of oil. Then he said, go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. When thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So here's the instruction. This is the word of God. Now, she can either go, oh, okay, that sounds great, or she can say, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. What is this going to do to help defer my debt and help me keep my sons? So she has to make a decision what she's going to do at this point. And he tells her to go get the vessels. Does he tell her how many to get? No, there's no number involved. Just says, don't make it a small number. Go get a lot. And then when you do, shut the door, take that pot of oil and start pouring it in to all these pots and pans, cups, whatever you found. And when it's full, set it off to the side. So she went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, there is not a vessel more. And the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children on the rest. Now, it's interesting here because this is really, in my mind, a great example of believing in action, this active believing. This widow woman and her sons had a tremendous financial need and no means to pay the creditor. She didn't have a Bible open and read, so she went to the prophet to see what God's will was in the situation. Elisha told her, and now the rest was up to her. She had to make a decision. Do I take action and believe that the results will be there, or do I choose to find a more, quote, sensible method to meet my need? At risk was the freedom of her two sons. She chose to believe Elisha. We come to those kind of situations in our lives at times, maybe not as dire as this particular woman's, but we have situations in our life where we have to choose, do we take the action of what we believe God's will is, or do we choose a, quote, more sensible way? We know that God says that he'll guide our steps. He'll lead us down those paths. He'll direct our steps if we trust in him. I don't know if you can see back behind me, but I have Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 up on my wall. That's to remind me where I'm supposed to put my thinking and trust. That's what she did, only she did it based on what Elisha had told her. I already said Elisha didn't tell her how many vessels to get. He only told her to get a lot. So the decision on how many vessels to gather was up to her and her sons, or it was limited by the number of empty pots and pans the neighbors had on hand. The great miracle is that it didn't run out until the last vessel. I think of a woman by the name of Corrie ten Boom. Many of you may have read her books. Her and her sister were in World War II, were taken to concentration camps. And her sister had an illness or a situation in her life where she needed this little vial of vitamins that she had, and they managed to get it smuggled in. And they believed God to have enough to give her every single day. And that vial never went empty for quite a while until her sister finally passed away. And then she turned it upside down and not even a drop would fall out. Same type of situation here. If they had gathered another dozen, it would have filled all those too. God didn't set a limit on how many. It's interesting to note that the family didn't know why they were doing all this work. Remember, she filled the pots and the vessels, then went back and said, okay, they're full. What am I supposed to do with it? He never told her, you're going to sell those and make the money to pay off your debt. So it wasn't like she had a promise, only a task to carry out. God sometimes will not give us every step in the path of which we're supposed to follow. Sometimes we just got to trust that the next step that we take is the one we're supposed to be on, and then God will show us the next one and the next one. Many of us learn this in our what we call the intermediate class, or the tongues and interpretation of prophecy class, when we learned how to interpret speaking in tongues or have a word of prophecy. We were told, don't worry about the second word, just get the first word out and the next one will be there. That's many times how God still works with us when we believe his word. It was only after they filled all these vessels that they find out that they were to sell the oil to pay the creditors. And God was so wonderful that not only did their believing action take care of their immediate need, but also provided for the future income. Remember, he told her to go sell it and live on the rest? God could have had it so she just had enough to pay her bills, but then she still would have had a need, right? No, God was even exceeding abundantly above. He gave her enough so her and her two sons could live on it. Isn't that great? God sure takes care of us. And I'm sure it wasn't just a meager, a hand-to-mouth existence. She didn't stop believing, but she saw the power of God in action. Would God do any less for you? I don't think so. We're going to take a look at another one. It's in 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6. This is dealing with Elisha again. Verse 1. And the sons of the prophets said unto Elisha, behold now, the place where we dwell with thee is too strait or small for us. Let us go, we pray thee, unto Jordan, and take thence every man a beam, and let us make a place there where we may dwell. And he answered, okay, let's go. And one said, be content, I pray thee, and go with thy servants. And he answered, I will go. So they all gathered their tools, they gathered their lumber, they gathered their nails, whatever they needed to go build this cabin, this home, and they all took off. And they came to the Jordan and they cut down more wood. And verse 5, but as one was felling a beam, the axe head fell into the water. Now, I don't know if you've ever had this happen, maybe not with an axe, but maybe with a hammer, something that has like a hammer head. There's usually, it's on the handle, and there's a little wedge or something that spreads that piece of wood out inside that hole in that hammer or axe or sledgehammer, whatever it might be, and that's what holds that together. Well, they probably had something similar, and as this one individual was swinging the axe, he probably swung it back to take a swing, and whoop, off goes the axe head. And it just didn't land over someplace, it fell into the water. And he cried and said, alas, master, for it was borrowed. Look, this isn't even my own tool. Now, I'm sure if it was me, I would go down into the water and I'd be feeling around. I'd try and find that thing. I'd call my buddy. I'd say, Jeff, get over here. Give me a hand. We'd start feeling around. We'd try and find that thing. I don't think they just ran off and said, oh my gosh, what do we do? I think they probably looked for it for a while, but they couldn't find it. But they went and told Elisha, and verse 6, it says, and he said, where'd it fall? And he said, it fell over there someplace. And Elisha cut down a stick and cast it in thither, and the iron did swim. So what he did is Elisha went over and found a branch. He cut it off, long stick, may have trimmed the edge down on one side, and then he just literally stuck the stick down into the river. Now, I've been by rivers. I don't know if the Jordan is a muddy river or something like that, but I don't think he could see. Otherwise, they would have found it. And when he stuck that stick in, the very first time he stuck it in, the stick went down into the water and went into the hole of that axe head, and then he pulled it up out of the water. Now, I don't know what the odds would be in Las Vegas for that happening on the first try, but I'd say the odds would be greatly against Elisha being able to find that axe head in that manner. But that's what happened. You know what? He said, take it up, and he put out his hand and he took it. So they had to believe, but even more important, Elisha had to believe. So again, your thinking would probably not be, okay, go over and cut down this stick and stick it in the water. Okay, well, what's that going to do? Maybe he thought he'd feel it down there, but he believed that God would take care of it and get the axe head back. Up it came. It's a great example, again, of believing, even though when it doesn't make any sense, 5 senses wise, of what they were doing. Elisha could have told him, okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's take up a collection. We'll all pitch in some money and we'll pay for this axe head and we'll just replace it. He didn't do that. God took care of him. He believed, he stuck it in the water. The stick went in the hole. He pulled it up. It was another miracle of God, but it wouldn't have happened if Elisha hadn't believed and then acted. He saw the power of God in action. These examples are in the Word to show us what God is able and willing to do for those who trust, believe, and then act to see his power in action. So why would we ever stop believing God? That's a question I would ask myself. And I've been there. I've given up at times when I shouldn't have. With these and so many other examples in the Word, why would you ever stop believing God in any situation? There's probably a lot of answers. Perhaps you said or thought some of these following things at times. It's taking too long to come to pass. Well, I've been believing for a whole 15 minutes and it isn't here yet. Sometimes we have to believe for days, weeks, maybe even years. I don't understand it. I can't explain it. All I know is that if God tells us to believe something, we continue to believe until it comes to pass. But maybe we said, oh, it's taken too long. It's not coming on my time. Or maybe another one. I'm tired. The struggle is just too hard. I can't take it anymore. Sometimes when people are sick or having some physical issues, this can be a difficult one to fight in their mind. I've been there. Where I've had to handle things and take care of it. And it is difficult, but we can still trust God to take care of us in any situation. Or another, maybe God doesn't really want this for me. A lot of people that have that kind of thinking think that they don't deserve it. God doesn't want them to have it. They've done something wrong in their life. A number of years ago, when we were in a leadership training program, we had sponsors, and our sponsorship had run out. We just weren't getting any money and we got a little bit behind. And so I prayed and Sheila prayed, and we had a small group of believers that prayed with us to get this taken care of. And God showed me what to do. Well, the immediate results didn't come in, and I only had 10 days to get the money, or Sheila and I and our family would have to leave. But we kept praying and believing that we did what we were supposed to do, and we were just waiting to see the results come in. During that time, I had somebody come up and sit down with me and say, Mike, we understand that you're not getting your money in for your sponsorship. What is it that you've done that's keeping you from receiving God's abundance? And I said, I haven't done anything other than what I believe God wanted me to do. What was interesting is a day or two later, I received a phone call from a believer that we had helped in another area years ago. He was a doctor in the state. He got my note. He called me. Not only did he pay the amount that we were due, but just like that woman and her 2 sons, he paid enough to make sure that we finished our in-resident training for us so that we could wouldn't have to think about it the rest of the time we were in residence, which was about another 3 or 4 months. That's how great God is. Unfortunately for that individual and their family, they did not get their sponsorship together and were unable to graduate that year from the Way Corps. They did later, but I wonder sometimes if the same thinking about what she thought affected her believing and trusting God. If God says he wants it for you, he'll do everything he can to make sure that you get it. Maybe God is trying to test my faith. God doesn't test us. We just stay faithful. Or if I could only build my believing, then I would receive it. I think this building my believing, we're either believing or we're not believing. Now, yes, we can, over time, as we trust God and see God, we see us to be able to believe maybe for bigger and greater things. But it's not a building process. We either believe or we don't believe. We either trust or we don't trust. And so I think sometimes this is used to either as an excuse for people, or sometimes leaders have shared this. And I think it's been a way that indirectly have put people in a bad situation because they believe they aren't doing the right things to build this believing. Okay, we're going to look at one more example in the Word, but because we've spent a lot of time on this individual in recent teachings, and quite honestly, I don't have the time to go through the whole record. I'm going to kind of summarize some things, and it's about our wonderful friend and believer Joseph in the Old Testament. I want to look at some examples of where this individual could have stopped believing and maybe even would have felt justified in doing so. We don't have time to go through it, like I said, but I'm going to highlight some things. So God shows Joseph in a dream or a vision that his family would someday being paid obeisance to him. His family mocked him and didn't believe him, being the youngest of the brothers at that time. If your own family doesn't support you, maybe you should just quit believing. Sometimes some of us have been in families that didn't believe what we believe and didn't support us in that, maybe contradicted us or even fought with us. Years ago, they had family that would try and do deprogramming of their children if they felt like they were in a wrong situation. Well, Joseph, taking this ridicule from all his brothers and his family, he could have just said, it's not worth all the hassle. I'm not going to believe what God was telling me in this dream. But did he quit? No, he always hung on to that belief. And we'll see that in the record if we went through and read it all. Later on, Joseph is attacked by his brothers and thrown into a pit. While in there, he could actually overhear his brothers talk about killing him. And they decided maybe it was better instead to sell him into slavery and make some money in the process. This might have been a good time to get discouraged and stop believing. I can't even begin to imagine sitting there. Remember, they threw him in the pit with no water or food while they sat up there and ate and talked right above him. And he could hear everything they were talking about. What a discouraging process when your own brothers do that and are willing to either kill you or sell you into slavery. But he didn't get discouraged. It may have been tough, but he hung in there. Joseph ends up being sold to Potiphar, and over a period of time, he works his way to the top position in Potiphar's house. Hey, this is a good time just to keep believing, right? Sometimes when we think things are going, we're like, oh, this is easy. I can believe this. Well, it's easy to believe when everything's going well. It's when things get tough sometimes that we want to quit. So, or we quit believing because things get so good, we think we don't have to believe anymore. That's the other side of that coin. Well, things are going so good that Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, and when that doesn't work, she accuses him of rape and has him thrown into prison. Well, after all that, I guess God has abandoned me. It's just not worth the struggle anymore. So I'll just be happy with what I have. So I guess this is my lot in life. You know, I tried to believe with my family. They were going to kill me. They sold me into slavery. I managed to work my way up in this household, and that had to take time. You just don't hire a slave and then put him in charge of everything. He had to demonstrate over and over again his abilities. And then he gets thrown into prison for something he didn't even do. Don't you think that'd be a good time just to give it up and say, forget it. This is terrible. I mean, where's God? Look what he keeps doing to me. It's just not worth it anymore. So I'll just settle down and just take my lot in life here in the prison. Well, Joseph in prison manages to get in a position where he's actually running it as a prisoner. It's as good as it gets in his situation. And he meets two of Pharaoh's staff, the baker and the butler. He interprets their dreams, makes one a promise to remember him once he's freed. Well, that doesn't happen. He could have said, I've stood faithfully all these years, and look, what good has it done me? This has gone on for quite some time. Well, finally, the butler remembers Joseph and tells Pharaoh about his ability to interpret dreams. Joseph is made the second in charge of Egypt under Pharaoh. Finally, things are looking good. I don't need to keep believing anymore. It appears that Joseph didn't stop believing, but being in the top position of Pharaoh wasn't the end of it. He still needed to believe to see the dream that God had given him many years earlier come to pass. And I think this is what I want you to see about Joseph. The first we learn about Joseph is when God gives him this dream. That dream has not come to pass yet. It's not come to pass. So is he still believing to see that come to pass? Well, we're going to read part of a record here. And you can go to Genesis 45. Okay, Genesis 45, verse 1. Then Joseph, his brothers have been brought before him. They don't know who he is. And because obviously he's dressed like an Egyptian, his look has changed. I hadn't seen him in many, many years. And this takes us into that record. Then Joseph could not refrain himself before all of them that stood by him, and he cried. Because every man caused every man to go out from me, and there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known unto his brother. So he sent everybody in the room out that wasn't his family, and he told them who he was. And he wept aloud. And the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? And his brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. Do you think over all those years, the thoughts of what they had done to their brother might have come back to them? And maybe they had regrets, but they certainly never thought they'd see him again. And now here they are, and he tells them who he is. One of the most powerful men in the world, they're standing before him, and they had done him a terrible evil and injustice. And Joseph said unto his brethren, Come near to me, I pray you. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. He hadn't forgotten. They certainly hadn't. Now, therefore, be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves. Wow, that's quite a statement. That ye sold me hither, for God did send me before you to preserve life. He knew what God had done. And for him to get in the position, he wouldn't have never been sold as a slave into Egypt and then put into Pharaoh's audience. Never would have happened. God knew there would have to be a series of incidents to get him in that position. I'm not saying God put him in those positions. I'm saying God knew ahead of time and knew how it was all going to come together. He saw the whole puzzle put together. Joseph knew why he was there. He said in verse 6, For these 2 years hath the famine been in the land, and yet there are 5 years in which there shall be neither be earing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you a prosperity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sent me hither, but God, and hath made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Joseph needed to believe each and every day until this day came to pass. There were so many opportunities to stop believing. It was about 13 years from the time he was sold into slavery until he was put into the position by Pharaoh. Then another 7 years of feast and at least a couple years of famine before his family came to see him. Approximately 22 or more years had passed. We don't always see the power of God in action right away. Sometimes you must allow God to work in the situation, always believing to see his power at work. God will never let us down, ever. Joseph believed all those years for that. Now, we don't read the record in here where he brings his whole family, but they had to bow down to him because of his position in Egypt. And the dream came to pass, but it wasn't just them bowing down, it's what God had placed Joseph there to do. A few times over the last number of years, I've gone back and done kind of a retrospective look at my time as a believer since I was 17, and that was over 52 years ago. And when I look back at some of the situations that I was in, I didn't understand why things happened the way they did. We trusted God to take care of us and to bring us into what we needed to be in. And sometimes those times were very, very difficult and very tough. Other times things were fantastic. But through all those times, I just believed that God would take care of me and my family. And he's always done that. And we've just had to believe and take action. I haven't always done the right thing. Sometimes I've done the wrong thing. Sometimes I've, quote, taken that sensible approach rather than what God has shown me to do. But I've been thankful enough to be able to look back over all those years and see the connections that God has made and how certain things have fallen in place in my life to get me where I am today. I don't know what God holds for tomorrow, but I know he holds tomorrow, and that's what counts. And as long as I trust him, then I'm going to see it come to pass. I mentioned that verse on the back of my wall here, and we're going to go there. Proverbs chapter 3. And in verse 5. It says, trust in the Lord with most of your heart. Trust in the Lord with all your heart when everything is going well for you. Trust in the Lord if it makes sense to you. No, it doesn't say any of that. It says, trust in the Lord with all thine heart. If we're trying to hold back a certain amount of our heart or protect us from being hurt or maybe being disappointed, that's not all of our heart. Okay, well, maybe we've had disappointments because maybe things didn't go what we thought they were going to be. That's why I wanted you to see Joseph. Look at all the situations that man went through. I don't think any of us have gone through those kind of situations in our life. I certainly haven't. It says, trust in the Lord with all our heart. If we trust God, if we believe God to the point where we're willing to act upon it, we give him all our heart. And lean not unto thine own understanding, that more sensible route that we think is out there. In how many ways? In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Joseph understood this. He understood that God had directed his paths all those years to get him where he needed to be. Would it have been the path that Joseph would have taken on his own? Absolutely not. But God directed his paths. Sometimes we don't understand the path that we're on, but if we believe it's God's will and he's directing us, he will get us where we need to go. Many of you know that I've shared on the biblical shepherd many times. And of course, Psalm 23 is a big part of that. Psalm 23 is a very short psalm, but it's interesting. It starts out, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And it ends in, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Those are the two bookends of that particular psalm. What's smack dab in the middle of that psalm? Walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Just because things go well sometimes doesn't mean that we're always going to be on the pleasant and good paths. But it says that he'll lead us down those paths of righteousness. Sometimes those paths of righteousness take us right through the adversary's terrain and areas where he rules. But you know what? It doesn't make any difference, because if we're following the shepherd and we're putting all our trust in God, it says he's going to take us that. And he says he'll set a table before us, before all of our enemies, where we can dine in peace, where we can have that joy and peace. All right, let's get back to Proverbs chapter 3. Be not wise in thine own eyes. That's one I should probably put on everything I own, because that's the biggest problem I have. Fear or love or respect the Lord and depart from evil. Well, what's the evil we have to depart from? Being wise in our own eyes, not acknowledging him, leaning under our own understanding. He says those are evil. Why? Because it's going against what God wants to do for us. And if we do these things, if we are not wise in our own eyes, if we allow God to direct our paths, it says it shall be health to thy navel. Okay, how many want a healthy navel out there? Raise your hand. Right? What does that mean? It's physical health. It's physical health. For a baby, that navel is where everything for life kept that baby going all that time. And marrow to thy bones. That's where the life is in the blood, right? And where is the blood produced? It's produced in the marrow. This is saying it'll be life to you. Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thine increase. It's interesting to me that that falls in this context. Why? Because it's trusting in the Lord with all your heart. Otherwise, what are we putting our trust in? Our finances, our own wealth, our own abilities? So shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses shall burst out with new wine. Man, I want barns full of plenty, and I want a bunch of new wine. It says that's all going to happen. That's abundance. Just like that lady and her 2 sons. They had abundance when it was all done. I think about Peter when he cast out the nets. He had enough pulled in. He could have lived on that for the whole time he was with Jesus. God does exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, if we believe and act and wait to see the power of God in action. The stuff in Proverbs is a promise of God. The health and prosperity may not always be there immediately, but when we act or trust or act with believing, we will see the power of God in action. Don't stop believing. God bless you.